June 19th, 1944, Philippine Sea. At 13°, 137° RE, the sky above Task Force 58 was white with heat. Midday sun turned the Pacific into hammered aluminum, glare so bright it hurt to look at the horizon without squinting. On the flight deck of the carrier, Lexington, anti-aircraft crews stood at their guns, sweat soaking through their dungarees, eyes scanning the eastern sky. The radar operators had been calling contacts for an hour, enemy aircraft, many of them, closing from the west. The first wave was minutes away. Seaman First Class Robert Lawson stood beside a 40mm Bofors mount, his hands already on the loading mechanism. He had been at Tarawa, he had been at Kwajalein. He knew what was coming. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes pushing through flak, some of them burning, all of them committed. Ships would be hit, men would die. That was the arithmetic of carrier warfare in 1944. But this time, something was different. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. The fire control officer's voice crackled over the sound-powered phone. Proximity fuses armed, stand by. Lawson didn't know what that meant. None of them did. It was a new term, added to the pre-battle checklist only a few weeks earlier. The 5-inch guns had been loading shells with red bands around the nose instead of the usual black. No one had explained why. Scuttlebutt said they were experimental, some kind of secret weapon. Then, at 12,000 yards, the forward 5-inch batteries opened fire. The shells climbed into the white sky, arcing toward the incoming formations. Yokosuka, D-4Y dive bombers, 23 of them, still in tight formation, still too high for the Bofors or the 20mm guns. Lawson watched the black puffs of flak blossom around them, the familiar dark clouds of timed detonations. But among the black puffs were others, white, brighter, appearing suddenly and without the telltale smoke trail. They appeared next to the aircraft, not above them, not below them, next to them. And the aircraft began to fall, not one or two trailing smoke and fire in the theatrical death spirals that Lawson had seen before, but 3, 4, 5 at once, wings shearing off, fuselages tumbling, explosions that looked like they had happened inside the planes themselves. The formation disintegrated, survivors scattered, their bombing runs disrupted before they even began. More white bursts followed them, snapping into existence with eerie precision, and more aircraft fell. Lawson turned to the gunner beside him. "What the hell was that?" The gunner shook his head, eyes wide. "I don't know, but whatever it is, keep loading." They never found out, not officially, not for months. The new fuses were classified higher than top secret. Their existence was not to be mentioned in letters home, not discussed over chow, not recorded in deck logs except by code. The war would be over before most sailors understood what they had witnessed. But the Japanese understood. They understood immediately, and what they understood filled them with a cold, creeping dread that no amount of courage or bushido could dispel. The Americans had made their shells intelligent. They had taught metal to think, to sense, to kill without being aimed. And if the Americans could do that, then the war, perhaps, had already been lost. The variable time fuse, known by its cryptonym VT fuse or proximity fuse, was born from a problem as old as anti-aircraft warfare itself. Hitting a moving target in 3 dimensions with a projectile that explodes at a fixed time or altitude. Traditional anti-aircraft shells use time fuses, mechanical devices set before firing to detonate after a calculated number of seconds. Gunners estimated target altitude and speed, calculated lead, set the fuse, and fired. If the calculations were correct, the shell exploded near the target, creating a burst of shrapnel that might damage or destroy the aircraft. The system was imperfect. Aircraft maneuvered. Altitude estimates were wrong. Wind deflected shells. Fuse mechanisms jammed or burned inconsistently. Studies conducted by the U.S. Navy in the late 1930s suggested that hitting a maneuvering aircraft with timed anti-aircraft fire required an average of 2,500 to 3,000 rounds per kill. Against mass bomber formations, this was expensive but acceptable. Against fast, agile dive bombers and torpedo planes attacking at low altitude, it was nearly useless. The British, suffering under the Blitz, understood this better than anyone. In 1940, they approached American scientists with a proposal: develop a fuse that could detect its proximity to a target and detonate automatically. The idea was not new. Inventors had fantasized about such devices for decades, but the engineering challenges were immense. The fuse had to be small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. It had to survive the acceleration of firing, up to 20,000 Gs. It had to function reliably after being subjected to spin, vibration, and temperature extremes. It had to be cheap enough to mass produce. And it had to do all of this while hurtling through the air at supersonic speeds toward a target that was also moving. In May 1940, the United States was not yet at war, but President Roosevelt authorized funding for the project under the auspices of the National Defense Research Committee. Work began at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, led by physicist Merle Tuve. The initial concept was simple: embed a miniature radio transmitter and receiver inside the fuse. The transmitter would emit a continuous radio signal. When the shell passed close to a large metal object, an aircraft, the reflected signal would increase in intensity. A threshold detector would sense this increase and trigger the detonation circuit. Simple in concept, nightmarish in execution. The first prototypes were the size of bread boxes and required external power supplies. The vacuum tubes, necessary for amplifying the weak radio signals, were fragile and prone to failure. Miniaturization was essential, but miniature vacuum tubes did not exist. They had to be invented. The battery had to provide reliable power despite the shock of firing. The antenna had to radiate efficiently despite being encased in a spinning metal shell. Every component had to be designed, tested, redesigned, tested again. By December 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the VT fuse program was still experimental. Prototypes existed, but they were unreliable and expensive. Each fuse cost roughly $1,000, compared to $10 for a standard time fuse. The Navy, desperate for any advantage in the Pacific, funded accelerated testing. By mid-1942, fuses were being tested aboard ships in the Caribbean. By early 1943, they were ready for combat. Deployment, but under conditions of absolute secrecy. The secrecy was not paranoia. If a VT fuse fell into enemy hands intact, reverse engineering was possible. The Allies could not risk the Axis developing their own proximity fuses, especially Germany, whose V-1 flying bombs and later weapons could have been made devastatingly effective with proximity-fused warheads. Therefore, VT fuses were initially restricted to naval use only, where duds would fall into the ocean and sink. Land-based use was forbidden until December 1944, when the Battle of the Bulge made the risk acceptable. The first combat use came in January 1943, when the cruiser Helena used VT-fused 5-inch shells against Japanese aircraft in the Solomon Islands. The results were promising but inconclusive. Only a handful of fuses were available, and the action was brief. But over the following months, production ramped up. By mid-1944, VT fuses were standard issue for the fleet. Over 22 million proximity fuses were manufactured during the war, the majority for the Navy's 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns. And then came the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought on June 19, 1944, was the last great carrier battle of the Pacific War. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 Japanese carriers and 430 aircraft, tasked with destroying the American invasion fleet attacking Saipan. He faced Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. The Americans had 891 aircraft. Ozawa believed he had advantages. His aircraft had longer range. They could strike American carriers from distances where American planes could not respond. He could also use Guam and other island bases to refuel and rearm, effectively giving his planes greater endurance. And his pilots, though no longer the elite veterans of 1941 to 42, were still samurai of the sky, trained in the spirit of Bushido, willing to die for the Emperor. What Ozawa did not know was that Task Force 58 was a floating fortress of radar-directed firepower equipped with a technology his pilots had never encountered. The Japanese launched their first attack wave at 8:30 a.m., 69 aircraft. American radar detected them at 70 miles. Fighter direction officers vectored Hellcats to intercept, and the slaughter began long before the attackers reached the carriers. But some broke through. They came in fast and low, skimming the wavetops to avoid radar, climbing for their attack runs as the American ships opened fire. The engagement was recorded in after-action reports with clinical precision. USS Alabama, a battleship, fired 649 5-inch VT-fused rounds during the battle. Her gunners claimed 32 aircraft destroyed. South Dakota fired 784 rounds and claimed 24 kills. Indiana fired 639 rounds. The carriers themselves bristled with 5-inch mounts, all firing VT shells, all guided by radar fire control. Lieutenant Commander Robert Riera, gunnery officer aboard Lexington, described the experience in a post-war interview. "We knew the fuses were good, we'd tested them, but seeing them in action was something else. You'd fire a salvo, and the shells would burst right alongside the target, not 50 feet away, not 100 feet away, but right there, close enough that you could see the plane stagger from the shockwave. It was like having a perfect gunner who never missed. We stopped worrying about altitude and lead. The fuse did the thinking. We just pointed and shot." From the Japanese perspective, the experience was incomprehensible. Petty Officer First Class Kiyoshi. Ito, a gunner aboard a D-4Y dive bomber, survived the battle and was captured later in the war. His interrogation transcript, declassified in 1975, records his testimony. "The American fire was not like what we had seen before. There was no pattern to it. The shells exploded without warning, without the smoke trail we used to watch to judge when to maneuver. They exploded next to us, beside us, above us, everywhere at once. We could not evade. We could not predict. It was as if the shells were alive, hunting us. My pilot was a veteran of China and the Coral Sea. He had survived many battles, but that day he turned to me and said, 'We cannot win this.' Then his head was gone. A shell burst 3 meters away. There was no warning, no smoke, just light, and then he was gone. Ito's plane crashed into the sea. He was the only survivor. The Japanese had expected a hard fight. They had expected casualties. Naval air combat in 1944 was a brutal calculus of attrition. Even in defeat at Midway, Japanese pilots had accepted their losses with stoic resolve. Death in battle was honorable. The spirits of fallen pilots would reside at Yasukuni Shrine, honored forever. This was the spiritual armor that had sustained Japanese aviators through 3 years of war. But the VT fuse cracked that armor. It was not the lethality alone that demoralized them. Japanese pilots had faced deadly American firepower before. It was the precision, the sense that they were fighting not men but machines, that the enemy had weaponized mathematics itself. Traditional anti-aircraft fire could be evaded through skill and maneuver. A pilot could watch the black puffs of flak, judge the pattern, adjust his approach. There was agency in that. The belief that superior airmanship could prevail. The proximity fuse removed agency. It didn't matter how skilled you were. The shells followed you, sensed you, killed you with mechanical indifference. And because the fuses were secret, because the Japanese high command did not understand the technology, there was no tactical response, no doctrine, no countermeasure, just the growing realization that the Americans had achieved a level of technological sophistication that Japan could not match. Commander Kaname Konishi, a staff officer with the Japanese carrier fleet, survived the war and wrote extensively about the psychological impact. After the Philippine Sea, our pilots were different. They had faced death before. This was expected. But now they faced something worse, futility. They trained hard, they flew well, and still they died in numbers we could not sustain. The Americans' guns had become intelligent. Our spirit, no matter how strong, could not overcome their science. This realization spread like a disease. Pilots who once volunteered eagerly for missions now had to be ordered. Some accepted reassignment to kamikaze units not out of fanaticism, but because at least in a suicide dive, death was certain and immediate. Better that than the slow terror of watching your comrades explode in midair for reasons you could not understand. The statistics from June 19, 1944, bear out the carnage. Ozawa launched 4 attack waves, totaling 373 aircraft. Only 130 returned. American losses, 29 aircraft, mostly to operational causes. Not a single American ship was sunk. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was immediately nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots and sailors, a dark joke about the one-sided slaughter. But it was no joke to the radar operators and gunners who witnessed the VT fuses in action. They understood they were using something extraordinary, a weapon that represented a quantum leap in lethality, and they were sworn never to speak of it. The symbolic weight of the proximity fuse extended beyond its tactical effectiveness. It was, in a sense, the perfect embodiment of American industrial and scientific culture in the mid-20th century. The United States did not win the war through superior courage or ideology. Japanese soldiers and airmen were, if anything, more willing to die. German soldiers were tactically proficient and disciplined, but the Allies, and especially the Americans, won through superior logistics, production, and applied science. The VT fuse was expensive, complex, and required precision manufacturing. Each fuse contained a miniature vacuum tube, a battery, a radio transmitter and receiver, an antenna, a detonator, and supporting circuitry, all packed into a cylinder roughly the size of a soda can, all designed to survive forces that would pulverize most electronics. Mass-producing such devices required advanced factories, skilled workers, quality control, and a supply chain capable of delivering millions of units. Japan could not have produced the VT fuse, even if they had captured intact examples and reverse-engineered the design. They lacked the manufacturing infrastructure. They lacked the specialized vacuum tubes. They lacked the radio frequency engineering expertise. Most critically, they lacked the raw materials: copper for wiring, tungsten for tube filaments, rubber for shock mounting, chemicals for batteries. By 1944, Japan's economy was strangling under the American submarine blockade. Factories were closing for lack of materials. Civilian food rations were being cut. The idea of spending $1,000 worth of precision components on a single artillery shell would have been absurd. This disparity, abundance versus scarcity, became the recurring motif of the Pacific War's final years. American carriers served steak and ice cream. Japanese sailors ate weevil-infested rice and called it a good meal. American pilots flew new Hellcats with 2,000 horsepower engines. Japanese pilots flew obsolete Zeros with failing engines and patched fuel tanks. American shells thought for themselves. Japanese shells, if they had any left, exploded on timers or not at all. The proximity fuse was, in this context, not merely a weapon, but a message. We can afford to make our artillery shells intelligent. Can you? The answer was evident in the skies over the Philippine Sea, in the empty flight decks of Ozawa's carriers, in the oil slicks and floating debris that marked where aircraft had fallen. There exists in the U.S. National Archives, a remarkable piece of captured Japanese correspondence dated August 1944. It is a letter from a junior officer in the Naval Air Technical Arsenal to his superiors, written after studying fragments of a VT fuse recovered from an unexploded American shell found on Guam. The translation is formal, technical, but a note of despair is unmistakable. Analysis of the device confirms our worst suspicions. The Americans have developed a miniature radio proximity detector, incorporating principles we have studied, but never successfully miniaturized. The level of precision manufacturing evident in the construction exceeds our current capabilities. Recommendation: immediate research into countermeasures. However, it must be noted that development of equivalent technology would require resources and industrial capacity we no longer possess. Alternative recommendation: accept that enemy anti-aircraft fire will achieve historically unprecedented effectiveness. Adjust tactics accordingly. Probability of success? Low. The letter was filed and forgotten. No countermeasures were developed. Tactics were not adjusted, because no adjustment could compensate for a technology that made every shell a guided weapon. By late 1944, the VT fuse was no longer limited to naval use. As Allied armies pushed into Germany, the fuse was authorized for land-based artillery. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, American artillery units firing VT fuse shells devastated German infantry and armor with airbursts that rained shrapnel from above. bypassing foxholes and entrenchments. German soldiers called them ghost shells, explosions that appeared overhead without warning, impossible to hide from. General George S. Patton reportedly said the VT fuse won the Battle of the Bulge. This was hyperbole. Many factors contributed, but the fuse's psychological impact was undeniable. German troops, already demoralized by years of attrition and Allied air supremacy, now faced artillery that could kill them even in cover. Surrender rates increased, desertions increased. The will to fight, already eroded, crumbled further. In the Pacific, the VT fuse became standard for all naval engagements. During the Battle of Okinawa, kamikaze attacks intensified, with Japanese pilots deliberately crashing explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. It was a tactic born of desperation, a final expenditure of lives in exchange for marginal damage. The VT fuse made even this horrific calculus untenable. Kamikaze aircraft were engaged at longer ranges and destroyed in greater numbers. The suicide planes still got through. 353 American ships were damaged or sunk by kamikazes during the Okinawa campaign, but the toll would have been far worse without proximity fuses. Lieutenant Commander Charles Ridgway, serving aboard the destroyer Laffey, described his ship's defense during a kamikaze attack on April 16, 1945. "We fired everything, 5-inch, 40 millimeters, 20 millimeters, rifles, pistols, anything that could shoot. The VT shells were going off all around the planes, and some of them just disintegrated in midair. Others got through. We were hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs, and somehow stayed afloat. But without the VT fuses, we'd have been hit by 20. The fuses didn't save us from all of them, but they saved us from enough." Laffey survived. 103 of her crew were killed or wounded, but she made it back to port. The ship still exists today. A museum in Charleston, South Carolina, her hull bearing the scars of that impossible fight. There is an audio recording, preserved in the Library of Congress, of a post-war interview with Captain Toshio Abe, a Japanese naval officer who survived the war and later worked as a technical liaison during the occupation. He was asked about the moment he realized Japan would lose the war. His answer is brief, almost dismissive, but it cuts to the bone. "I knew when I read the reports from the Philippine Sea, not because of the aircraft losses. We had suffered losses before, but because of how they died. Our pilots reported that the American shells were exploding at the precise moment and location to maximize lethality, not by chance, not by luck, by design. That level of technology indicated a gap we could never close. They had industrialized killing. We had only men willing to die. In such a contest, the outcome was inevitable. This was the true horror of the VT fuse, not the physical destruction it caused, but the psychological weight of confronting an enemy who could engineer solutions to problems you could barely articulate. The Japanese military-industrial complex, impressive by Asian standards, was pre-modern compared to the American system. Japan produced excellent optics, decent engines, and skilled machinists, but they could not produce radar-guided fire control, could not produce proximity fuses, could not produce the industrial base required to sustain a war of attrition against a continental power with unlimited resources. The VT fuse was a symbol of this disparity, a small, almost mundane object that represented an unbridgeable chasm in capability. And for the young men flying their aircraft into that chasm, the symbol was an epitaph. By the time the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the VT fuse was no longer a secret. Its existence had been declassified, and technical details were published in military journals. The Japanese government, in its final communications before surrender, mentioned the fuse specifically as an example of American technological superiority. It was listed alongside radar, long-range bombers, and atomic weapons, a catalog of innovations that Japan had attempted to counter and failed. Post-war analyses calculated that the VT fuse increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire by a factor of 3 to 5, depending on conditions. In practical terms, this meant that a gun requiring 2,500 rounds to score a kill with timed fuses required only 500 to 800 rounds with proximity fuses. The savings in ammunition were significant, but the true value was strategic. It freed resources, reduced logistical strain, and allowed smaller forces to defend larger areas. The British, who had initially proposed the project, incorporated VT fuses into their own anti-aircraft systems and credited them with reducing V-1 flying bomb impacts on London by significant margins. The Soviets, after receiving samples through Lend-Lease, attempted to reverse engineer the design, but their electronics industry was insufficiently advanced. It would be years before Soviet proximity fuses matched American performance. Germany, despite capturing numerous VT fuses on the Western Front, never successfully copied the design. By late 1944, German industry was collapsing under Allied bombing, and precision electronics manufacturing was beyond reach. They understood the principle. They simply lacked the means. Japan similarly captured intact fuses and analyzed them extensively. The reports concluded that replication was impossible given existing industrial capacity. The war ended before any serious attempt could be made. This technological asymmetry, the ability to deploy advanced systems that the enemy could understand but not replicate, was a defining feature of Allied victory. The VT fuse was not the largest or most destructive weapon of the war, but it was, in many ways, the most emblematic. It represented the marriage of science and industry, of theoretical physics and mass production, of abstract knowledge turned into concrete lethality. It was a weapon that required universities, laboratories, factories, supply chains, and logistical networks. A weapon that could only exist in a society with surplus capacity to devote to such projects. And it worked. There is a small museum at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland where the VT fuse was developed. Among the exhibits is a cutaway model of a proximity fuse, its components labeled and explained. Vacuum tubes smaller than a thumb, a battery no larger than a coin, an antenna etched onto the fuse body itself. Visitors, seeing the complexity packed into such a small device, often express surprise that it worked at all. But it did work. 22 million times, it worked. Next to the cutaway model is a photograph, yellowed with age, showing a Japanese aircraft exploding in midair. The plane is captured mid-disintegration, wings separating, fuselage breaking, smoke and fire trailing. Below it, the ocean is dark and indifferent. The caption reads, "Target destroyed by proximity-fused shell, June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea." There is no name for the pilot, no record of who he was, whether he was a veteran or a novice, whether he understood in his final second what had killed him. He is simply target destroyed, a data point in a battle report, a photograph in a museum. This is the ultimate fate of warriors confronted by superior technology. Reduction to statistics, to anonymity, to the passive voice of military pros. Target destroyed, aircraft lost, casualty inflicted. The VT fuse did not hate. It did not celebrate. It simply functioned, reliably and with terrible precision, until there were no more targets left to destroy. In the years after the war, American veterans would sometimes encounter former Japanese pilots at reunions or diplomatic functions. These meetings were often awkward, stilted by language barriers and memory, but occasionally a question would be asked. What was it like, facing the American fleet? The answers varied, but a common thread ran through them. Not bitterness, not anger, but a kind of resigned awe. One former pilot, whose name was not recorded, put it simply, "Your shells knew where we were, ours did not. In such a fight, courage is irrelevant." This was the final lesson of the proximity fuse, the truth it inscribed across the Pacific in smoke and shrapnel, that technology, when sufficiently advanced, renders individual valor obsolete. The bravest pilot, flying the most daring attack, dies just as quickly as the coward if the enemy's shells are intelligent and his are not. It is a hard truth. It is perhaps an unfair truth. But it is the truth that defined the latter half of the 20th century and beyond, that wars are won not by heroes, but by logistics, not by spirit, but by systems, not by the will to fight, but by the capacity to produce. The young men who flew into the white bursts over the Philippine Sea believed in something, whether it was the emperor or duty, or simply the hope of returning home. They did not lack courage. They did not lack skill. They lacked only one thing, an industrial base capable of making metal think. And so they fell, without smoke, without warning, into the sea that remembers nothing and forgives nothing. The ocean is still there, blue and indifferent, marking the spot where 243 aircraft hit the water on a single day in June. There are no monuments, no markers, just water, and the slow accumulation of coral over aluminum, the sea's way of reclaiming what the sky once held. And somewhere in a museum, a small cylinder of metal and wire and glass sits behind a pane of protective glass, labeled and explained, its secrets no longer secret, its purpose now historical. It is a quiet thing. It makes no sound. It does not advertise its lethality, but it changed the world. It taught shells to think. And in doing so, it taught humanity that the future belongs not to the brave, but to the capable, to those who can harness science, organize production, and deploy complexity as a weapon. The Japanese understood this, too late to matter, but early enough to know. There is no smoke. There is no warning. There is only the white burst, and then silence. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.